December 9th, 1940, the western desert of Egypt. Lieutenant Pietro Maletti peered through the vision slit of his Carro Armato M13 40 medium tank, watching dust devils spiral across the barren landscape between Sidi Barrani and the Libyan border. The 26-year-old officer from Turin commanded one of 275 Italian tanks deployed in North Africa, machines that Italian propaganda claimed were the finest armoured vehicles in the Mediterranean. Through the shimmering heat haze, Maletti could see the forward positions of the 10th Army stretched across fortified camps, a defensive line that Mussolini had declared impregnable. What Lieutenant Maletti didn't know, what none of the Italian tank crews dug into their desert positions could have imagined, was that in less than 48 hours, the M13-40 tanks would face British cruiser tanks in the first major armoured engagement in North Africa, and the results would be so catastrophic, so one-sided, that Italian armour doctrine would collapse as completely as their defensive line. The M13-40 represented Italy's attempt to build a modern medium tank. Designed by Ansaldo, Italy's primary armour manufacturer, it was supposed to be the backbone of Italian armoured divisions. On paper, the specifications seemed respectable for 1940. A 47mm main gun, 42mm of frontal armour, a diesel engine producing 125 horsepower, and a crew of 4. Italian officers assured Mussolini that the M13-40 could match anything the British fielded. They were catastrophically wrong. The seeds of disaster were planted in the M13-40's design from the very beginning. The tank weighed 14 tons, but its underpowered diesel engine could barely push it to 20 miles per hour on good roads. In the soft sand of the western desert, that speed dropped to less than 10 miles per hour. The suspension system, a dated leaf spring design, made cross-country travel a bone-jarring ordeal that exhausted crews and damaged equipment. But the most critical flaw was the armour scheme. While the M13-40 boasted 42mm of frontal armour, this protection was achieved through bolted plates riveted to the frame. Italian metallurgy in 1940 was substandard compared to British or German production. The armour steel was brittle, prone to spalling, where the interior surface would fragment when struck, sending deadly metal shards through the crew compartment, even when rounds failed to penetrate. The rivets themselves became projectiles when the tank was hit, decapitating or maiming crew members. The main armament, a 47mm SL-32 gun, appeared adequate on paper. It could penetrate 45mm lines of armour at 500 metres. Against the light tanks and armoured cars that Italy had faced in Ethiopia and Libya, this was sufficient. Against British cruiser tanks with superior armour and longer-range guns, it would prove desperately inadequate. More problematic was the gun's mounting. Italian tank designers, following outdated doctrine, placed the main weapon in a limited traverse mount that restricted the gun to only 18 degrees of traverse left or right. To aim at targets outside this narrow arc, the entire tank had to rotate, a time-consuming process that made engaging mobile targets nearly impossible. The crew conditions inside the M13-40 were medieval. The interior temperature in the North African sun regularly exceeded 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Ventilation was virtually non-existent. The driver and hull gunner sat in a cramped compartment with limited visibility through narrow vision slits that collected dust and sand. The commander and main gunner in the turret fared little better. The turret was so cramped that the commander could barely move, making tactical awareness nearly impossible. Communication between tanks relied on flag signals or motorcycle couriers. Italian industry had failed to produce reliable radio sets, meaning tank platoons fought as isolated units rather than coordinated formations. By December 1940, approximately 100 M13-40 tanks were deployed with the Italian 10th Army in Egypt. They were spread among several divisions, including the Maletti Group, a mixed force of tanks and infantry positioned near the fortified camp of Nibewa, about 10 miles south of Sidi Barrani. General Pietro Maletti, after whom the group was named, was confident in his defensive position. His tanks were dug in as pillboxes, their frontal armour facing the expected British approach. Italian military doctrine viewed tanks primarily as mobile artillery, supporting infantry rather than operating as independent striking forces. This defensive mindset would prove fatal. The British Western Desert Force, commanded by Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor, was preparing Operation Compass, a limited offensive designed to push Italian forces back from their positions in Egypt. O'Connor had approximately 275 tanks under his command, a mix of types that on paper appeared inferior in numbers, but vastly superior in capabilities. The British armoured force included Matilda II infantry tanks, heavily armoured at 70 mm but slow, and more significantly A9, A10 and A13 cruiser tanks that would be the M1340's primary opponents. The British cruiser tanks represented a completely different design philosophy. The A13 cruiser tank Mark III, the most numerous British tank in Egypt, weighed 14 tons, similar to the M13-40, but was powered by a 340 horsepower Liberty engine that pushed it to speeds of 30 miles per hour cross-country. Its Christie suspension, licensed from American designer J. Walter Christie, provided excellent mobility over rough terrain. Most critically, it mounted a 2-pounder gun, 40mm caliber, with superior penetration characteristics and a fully traversing turret that could engage targets 360 degrees around the tank without moving the hull. The crucial difference wasn't just technical specifications. British tank crews in Egypt had been training intensively for months. They practiced formation tactics, radio communication, and coordinated manoeuvres. Every British tank was equipped with a radio set, allowing platoons and companies to fight as unified forces. Tank commanders could coordinate movements, concentrate fire, and respond to threats with unprecedented speed. The Italians, relying on flag signals and motorcycle couriers, were still fighting with Great War tactics. December 9, 1940, at 5 a.m, the British attack began. Matilda tanks of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment approached Nibewa camp from the west, the direction the Italians least expected. The Matildas, virtually immune to the Italian 47mm guns at normal combat ranges, crushed through defensive positions while British cruiser tanks of the 7th Hussars and 2nd Royal Tank Regiment swept around the flanks, seeking Italian armour. Lieutenant Maletti, commanding his platoon of 4 M1340 tanks dug in on the southern perimeter of Nibewa, first became aware of the attack when explosions erupted across the camp. Through his vision slit obscured by dust and smoke, he glimpsed shapes moving through the dawn light. British cruiser tanks advancing in line abreast formation, at speeds the Italian officer had never seen tanks achieve in desert terrain. The M1340s, dug in with only their turrets and upper hulls exposed, opened fire at approximately 800 metres. The first volley from the Italian 47mm guns achieved several hits. Crew members watching through binoculars reported strikes on British tanks, sparks indicating impacts. For a moment, hope flared among the Italian crews, then the British tanks kept coming. The 42mm armour on the A13 cruisers was sufficient at 800 metres to defeat the Italian 47mm rounds, especially when striking at oblique angles. The British tanks, instead of stopping to return fire in static positions as Italian doctrine assumed, continued advancing while firing on the move. The British 2-pounder guns opened up at 600 metres. The difference in effect was immediate and horrifying. The first M1340 struck erupted in flames as a 2-pounder solid shot penetrated the frontal armour, passed through the fighting compartment and ignited ammunition. The crew had no time to escape. The second tank, attempting to traverse its entire hull to bring the limited Traverse main gun to bear on a flanking British cruiser, was struck in the side armour. The 2-pounder round penetrated easily through the 25mm side plate. Inside, the impact created a storm of spalling. Metal fragments from the interior armour surface sprayed through the crew compartment at supersonic speeds. The commander was decapitated by a rivet that sheared off. The gunner was eviscerated by steel splinters. The driver, somehow still alive, tried to reverse the tank, but the engine, already overheating from prolonged idling, seized. Lieutenant Maletti's own tank fired 3 rounds at a British A13 cruiser at 400 metres, achieving 2 hits. The British tank shuddered under the impacts but continued advancing. The 2-pounder gun flashed. Maletti felt rather than heard the impact. The interior of the M1340 rang like a bell. Rivets began popping from their mounts, flying across the crew compartment. One struck the hull gunner in the face, pulping his features. The main gun's recoil mechanism failed, disabled by spalling damage. Maletti screamed for his crew to abandon the tank. The driver, already wounded by fragments, couldn't climb from his hatch. Maletti and his gunner escaped through the turret hatches as a second British round penetrated the engine compartment. The diesel fuel ignited, sending flames roaring through the crew spaces. Of the 4 M1340 tanks in Maletti's platoon, all 4 were destroyed within 7 minutes of engagement. Not one British cruiser tank was lost in the exchange. Across Nibewa camp, the story repeated with monotonous regularity. Italian tanks, immobile in their dug-in positions, were systematically destroyed by British cruisers that used their superior speed to flank, their radios to coordinate, and their fully traversing turrets to engage from any angle. The M1340s, designed to fight from static positions like pillboxes, found their limited gun traverse meant they could only engage targets directly in front of them. British tanks simply drove around them and shot them in the sides or rear where armour was only 25mm thick. General Pietro Maletti himself was killed in the initial assault, making him the highest-ranking Italian officer to die in North Africa at that point in the war. His death symbolised the complete collapse of Italian armoured doctrine. Within hours, Nibewa camp fell. Of approximately 35 M1340 tanks defending the position, 23 were destroyed and 12 captured intact after their crews fled. British losses were 4 cruiser tanks damaged, all of which were recovered and repaired. The catastrophe at Nibewa was just the beginning. Over the following days, Operation Compass continued. British forces attacked the fortified camps at Toma East and Toma West, encountering more Italian M1340 tanks. The results were identical. Italian tankers, demoralised by reports from Nibewa, found their worst fears confirmed. Their tanks couldn't penetrate British armour at effective ranges, couldn't manoeuvre to avoid British fire, couldn't communicate to coordinate defence, and couldn't withstand hits from 2-pounder guns. Sergeant Giuseppe Rossi of the Ariete Division recorded his experience at Tuma West in a diary later captured by British forces. The English tanks came like racing cars, faster than we thought possible. Our tank, our beautiful M13 that we had maintained perfectly, performed like a crippled mule. We fired, we hit them, nothing happened. They fired once. Once. The tank filled with smoke and metal pieces. My friend Carlo, he was screaming, his arm was gone. We ran, we all ran. There was nothing else to do. The tank was a death trap. The technical reasons for the M1340's failure became clear through British technical intelligence, examination of captured vehicles. The 47mm gun's ammunition used a shell with inadequate muzzle velocity. While the gun could theoretically penetrate 45mm of armour at 500 metres, this assumed perfect perpendicular impact on homogeneous armour plate. British cruiser tanks used face-hardened armour at angles that effectively doubled the protection. The Italian shells striking this armour often shattered without penetrating. Even when penetration occurred, the small explosive charge in Italian shells frequently failed to cause catastrophic damage. The British 2-pounder gun, despite its smaller calibre, used solid shot ammunition with significantly higher muzzle velocity. The solid steel projectiles relied on kinetic energy rather than explosive effect. When they penetrated, they created a cone of spalling on the interior surface that was far more deadly than the original projectile. Against the M1340's riveted construction, this effect was multiplied. Every rivet became a potential projectile. The brittle Italian armour steel spalled catastrophically, even from non-penetrating hits. One captured M1340, examined in detail by British engineers, showed the cumulative effect of combat damage. It had been struck 7 times by 2-pounder rounds. 3 had penetrated, 4 had failed to penetrate but had caused extensive spalling on the interior surfaces. The engineers noted that even the non-penetrating hits had rendered the tank effectively destroyed. The interior looked like a grenade had detonated inside. Rivets were torn from their mountings. Armour plates were cracked. Control linkages were severed by fragments. Most tellingly, there was blood on every surface. The crew compartment was a slaughterhouse. By December 11th, just 3 days into Operation Compass, Italian armoured forces in Egypt had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Of approximately 100 Slost M1340 tanks deployed with the 10th Army, 67 were destroyed, 28 were captured intact, and only 5 had escaped back to Libya. British armoured forces, by contrast, had lost only 9 cruiser tanks destroyed, with another 23 damaged but recoverable. The kill ratio was approximately 10-1 in favour of the British, one of the most lopsided armoured engagements in military history. The psychological impact on Italian tank crews was devastating. Survivors returned to their units spreading tales of invincible British tanks that shrugged off Italian shells while destroying M13 TRS-40s with single shots. Morale in Italian armoured units collapsed. When British forces advanced toward Bardia and Tobruk in late December, Italian tank crews increasingly refused to engage. Officers reported entire tank platoons abandoning their vehicles before contact with the enemy. Some crews disabled their own tanks to avoid having to fight. Tenente Colonnello Vittorio Ravenga, commanding the 4th Tank Regiment at Bardia, reported to his superiors in a radio message intercepted by British intelligence. "The men will not fight in the M13 tanks, they call them rolling coffins. Yesterday, a platoon abandoned 4 tanks that were in perfect mechanical order rather than face British cruisers. I cannot blame them. I have seen what happens. The M13 is not a tank, it is a target. We are sending men to certain death. The mechanical unreliability of the M1340 compounded combat losses. The diesel engine, theoretically an advantage for reducing fire risk, was chronically underpowered and prone to overheating in the desert climate. Sand infiltration destroyed air filters, leading to rapid engine wear. The cooling system was inadequate, resulting in frequent breakdowns. British forces advancing through abandoned Italian positions found dozens of M1340 tanks left intact. Not from combat damage, but from mechanical failure. Crews had simply walked away from vehicles that could no longer move. The suspension system was equally problematic. The leaf spring design, outdated even by 1940 standards, couldn't handle the stress of desert terrain. Springs broke with alarming frequency, immobilizing tanks far from any combat. The tracks, designed for European roads, wore out rapidly on sand and rock. Italian logistics couldn't keep up with replacement demands. By January 1941, more M1340 tanks were deadlined from mechanical issues than from combat damage. The fall of Bardia in January 1941 provided more evidence of the M1340's inadequacy. Italian forces defending the fortress had approximately 45 M1340 tanks. When the British 7th Armoured Division attacked on January 3rd, the results were even more one-sided than at Nibewa. British Matilda tanks, essentially immune to Italian 47mm fire, advanced through minefields and fortifications while cruiser tanks swept the flanks. Italian M1340s, attempting to manoeuvre in support of infantry, were destroyed at ranges where their own guns were ineffective. The engagement lasted less than 3 hours. Every Italian tank was destroyed or captured. British losses were 2 Matilda tanks to mines, 0 to Italian tank fire. A particularly telling engagement occurred when a single British A-13 cruiser tank commanded by Sergeant Tom Boardman encountered 5 M1340 tanks attempting to escape Bardia. Boardman's after-action report, preserved in the British National Archives, described the encounter. "We came over a rise and there they were, 5 Italian mediums in column trying to reach the coast road. I ordered the driver to close range while keeping the gun on target. The Italians saw us and began trying to traverse to engage. Their turrets moved so slowly. We fired on the move, hit the lead tank in the side. It brewed up immediately. The second tank attempted to reverse, but the suspension collapsed. We hit it twice. The remaining 3 crews abandoned their tanks and ran. We destroyed all 5 vehicles in less than 3 minutes. None of them managed to fire a shot at us. The capture of Tobruk in January 1941 added another 87 M1340 tanks to British hands, most of them abandoned intact by their crews. British technical teams examining these vehicles found them to be in generally good mechanical condition, but the crews had fled rather than fight. The psychological defeat was complete. The M1340 had become a symbol of Italian military inadequacy, a machine that crews refused to operate even when mechanically sound. British forces began using captured M1340 tanks for various secondary purposes. Some were employed as armoured recovery vehicles, others were used to tow disabled British tanks. A few were even pressed into service with Australian units defending Tobruk later in 1941, though Australian crews universally despised them. One Australian sergeant famously reported, "The Italians gave us these tanks. If we really hated someone, we'd give them to the Germans." The disaster in North Africa forced Italian military command to completely reassess their armoured doctrine and tank design. Reports flooding back to Rome painted a devastating picture. The M1340 was inferior to British tanks in every meaningful category: armour protection, firepower, mobility, mechanical reliability, and crew survivability. Italian industry was incapable of producing armour steel to British standards. Italian guns couldn't penetrate British armour at combat ranges. Italian engines couldn't match British power outputs. Ansaldo immediately began development of improved models, the M1441 and M1542, with more powerful engines and improved armour. But these modifications were incremental rather than revolutionary. The fundamental design flaws, the riveted construction, the limited gun traverse, the cramped crew conditions, the inadequate suspension, none of these could be fixed without a complete redesign. Italy lacked the industrial capacity, the metallurgical expertise, and the time to develop a truly competitive medium tank. The strategic implications of Operation Compass extended far beyond the immediate tactical defeats. Mussolini's dream of an Italian empire in Africa collapsed with his armoured forces. The 10th Army, which had advanced into Egypt with such confidence in September 1940, was destroyed. Over 130,000 Italian soldiers were captured. Hundreds of tanks were lost. British forces advanced 500 miles into Libya, capturing Benghazi and threatening Tripoli. Hitler, watching the catastrophe unfold, made the fateful decision to send German forces to North Africa. The Deutsche Afrika Korps, commanded by Erwin Rommel, arrived in February 1941 with Panzer III and IV tanks that were vastly superior to anything the Italians fielded. German tankers, examining Italian M13-40s, were horrified. German technical reports described the M1340 as inadequate for modern warfare and a liability rather than an asset. Rommel explicitly refused to incorporate Italian tank units into his combat formations, relegating them to rear area security duties. Italian tank crews who survived the desert fighting had their assessments of the M1340 validated by their German allies. German tankers conducting joint training exercises with Italian units were shocked by the M1340's limitations. One German panzer commander, Hauptmann Hans von Luck, wrote in his memoirs, "We conducted a training exercise with an Italian tank battalion equipped with M1340s. It was painful to watch. Their tanks could barely keep up with our march speed on roads. Off-road, they were hopeless. The guns couldn't penetrate our Panzer IIIs, even at point-blank range during practice. The Italian crews were brave men, but they were equipped with death traps. I would not have sent my worst enemy into combat in an M1340. The few M1340s that continued in Italian service were increasingly relegated to static defensive roles, dug in as immobile gun positions. This at least negated some of their mobility issues, though it did nothing to address their inadequate armour and armament. Even in these defensive roles, they were rarely effective. British cruiser tanks learned they could simply drive around Italian positions, forcing the M1340s with their limited gun traverse to rotate their entire hulls, a slow process that made them easy targets. One of the last significant uses of M1340 tanks in combat occurred during Operation Crusader in November 1941. Italian armoured units equipped with approximately 150 M1340 and the slightly improved M1441 tanks attempted to support German forces at Bir el Gubi. The results were predictable. British cruiser tanks, now including the improved Crusader model with better armour and the same 2-pounder gun, systematically destroyed Italian armour. Over 100 Italian tanks were lost in a single day of fighting. British casualties from Italian tank fire were negligible. Private Francesco Benedetti, a driver in an M1340, survived Bir el Gubi and recorded his experience in a letter home that was later captured by British censors. "They came at us like locusts, hundreds of English tanks. We fired, we hit them, they kept coming, then they fired back. The first shot killed our gunner, the second shot set the engine on fire. I was the only one who escaped. Our tank, it was like paper against their guns. We never had a chance. Nobody wants to fight in these tanks anymore. The Germans laugh at us. The English shoot us like rabbits. I want to come home." By 1942, Italian industry had largely abandoned the M1340 design in favour of the M1542, which featured a more powerful 192 horsepower diesel engine and slightly improved armour. But the fundamental design flaws remained. The riveted construction, the limited gun traverse, the inadequate main armament, all carried over to the new model. More significantly, by 1942, British forces were fielding American-supplied M3 Grant and M4 Sherman tanks, with 75mm guns that made even the improved Italian tanks obsolete before they reached the battlefield. The final assessment of the M13-40 came from British post-war analysis of Axis armoured vehicles. The British Directorate of Military Training published a comprehensive evaluation in 1946 that was devastating in its conclusions. The Italian M13-40 medium tank represents one of the least successful armoured vehicles of the Second World War. Its armour was inadequate, its armament ineffective, its mechanical reliability poor, and its crew conditions appalling. In our experience, the M13-40 was inferior to British cruiser tanks in every measurable category. The only advantage it possessed was that it existed in relatively large numbers, though this proved irrelevant as quantity could not compensate for such profound qualitative deficiencies. Italian tank crews displayed considerable courage in operating these vehicles, but courage alone cannot overcome fundamental design failures. The human cost of the M30-40's failures was staggering. Italian armoured units in North Africa suffered casualty rates approaching 80%. Thousands of young Italian men died in machines that couldn't protect them, couldn't manoeuvre effectively, and couldn't fight on equal terms with their opponents. Many more were captured after abandoning vehicles that had become psychological torture chambers. The trauma affected survivors for decades. Post-war interviews with Italian tank veterans revealed lasting psychological damage from the experience of fighting in M13-40s. Giuseppe Nardella, a tank commander who fought from 1940 to 1942, spoke in a 1978 interview about his experience. "We knew, all of us knew, that the M13 was a bad tank. But we were soldiers, we had orders, we had to fight. Every time we went into battle, we knew we probably wouldn't come back. The fear, you cannot imagine the fear. Waiting for that moment when the English shell would hit. The sound of the impact, like a hammer on an anvil, then the screaming, always the screaming. I was lucky. I was wounded only twice. My tank was destroyed 3 times under me. So many of my friends died. For what? For bad tanks that should never have been built." The M13-40's failures had broader implications for Italian military performance throughout World War II. The tank became a symbol of Italy's industrial inadequacy, poor strategic planning, and the gap between fascist propaganda and military reality. Mussolini had promised a modern, mechanized military capable of building an empire. Instead, Italian soldiers received equipment that was consistently inferior to their opponents. The M13-40 was perhaps the most visible example of this gap between aspiration and capability. Some historians have argued that the M13-40's poor performance was partly due to tactical misuse, that Italian commanders employed the tanks incorrectly, according to defensive doctrine rather than mobile warfare. There is some truth to this. Italian armoured doctrine was indeed outdated, emphasising static defence over manoeuvre. But even when Italian tanks attempted offensive operations, the results were no better. The fundamental design limitations, inadequate armour, insufficient armament, poor mobility, couldn't be overcome by superior tactics. The comparison with German tanks of the same period is instructive. The German Panzer FF, the primary German medium tank in 1940, also mounted a 37mm gun and had similar armour thickness to the M13-40. But the Panzer III used welded construction rather than riveted, eliminating the spalling problem. It had a fully traversing turret with superior optics. It mounted a more powerful engine, providing better power-to-weight ratio. Most critically, German tank design was evolutionary. When the 37mm gun proved inadequate, it was replaced with 50mm guns. When armour proved insufficient, it was upgraded. The Panzer III continued improving throughout the war. The M13-40 design was essentially stagnant, incremental improvements to the M1441 and M1542 failing to address fundamental flaws. Today, only a handful of M13-40 tanks survive in museums. The Italian Army Museum in Rome displays one that was recovered from the desert in the 1960s, still showing battle damage from British 2-pounder hits. The tank sits as a memorial to the men who fought in inadequate equipment, a reminder of the human cost of poor design and unrealistic strategic planning. The placard at the museum is brutally honest in a way that wartime propaganda never was. The M13-40 Carro Armato was the primary Italian medium tank of 1940-1942. Despite the courage of its crews, the vehicle proved inferior to British and later American tanks in armour protection, firepower, and mechanical reliability. Hundreds of Italian tankers died in these vehicles, fighting against superior equipment with determination that their machines could not match. In the broader context of World War II tank development, the M1340 represents a cautionary tale about the consequences of inadequate industrial capacity, poor metallurgy, outdated doctrine, and wishful thinking in military planning. Italy entered the war with tanks designed for colonial warfare against poorly equipped opponents. When those tanks faced modern armoured forces with superior equipment and training, the results were catastrophic. The engagement at Nabewa on December 9, 1940, was the first test of Italian armour against a peer opponent. Within hours the test was concluded. The M1340 had failed completely. Over the following months, every subsequent engagement only confirmed the initial verdict. Italian tank crews, watching their vehicles burn, their comrades die, and their formations collapse, learned the bitter lesson that courage and determination couldn't compensate for fundamentally flawed equipment. The British cruiser tanks that destroyed Italian armour at Nabewa weren't exceptional vehicles. The A-13 cruiser had its own problems: thin armour, mechanical unreliability, inadequate armament against later German tanks. But against the M1340, the British cruisers were more than sufficient. They were faster, better protected at combat ranges, better armed, and crewed by better trained soldiers, with superior communications. The gap in capability was so wide that the outcome was never in doubt. Lieutenant Pietro Maletti, who watched the first British cruisers approach through the dust on December 9th, died in his burning tank within minutes of the engagement starting. His death, and the deaths of thousands of other Italian tankers in the months that followed, testified to the consequences of sending men to fight in inadequate equipment. The M1340 wasn't just a bad tank, it was a death trap, a mechanical failure that cost lives and shattered Italy's dreams of empire. When the Italian M1340 first faced British cruisers in December 1940, it didn't just lose a battle, it collapsed as a military concept. The rivets failed, the armour spalled, the guns proved ineffective, and Italian armoured doctrine died in the desert sand along with the men who had trusted their lives to inadequate machines. The thunder of British 2-pounder guns wrote the epitaph for Italian armour. The M1340 had been tested in the furnace of combat and found catastrophically wanting. The strategic ramifications of the M1340's failure extended far beyond the immediate battlefield losses. In Rome, Mussolini's military leadership faced a crisis of confidence that permeated every level of Italian armed forces. General Ugo Cavallero, appointed chief of the Italian General Staff in December 1940, just as reports from North Africa were reaching their most alarming, found himself confronting a truth that fascist propaganda had long concealed. Italy's industrial base was incapable of producing armoured vehicles competitive with those of major powers. The Ansaldo Company, Italy's primary tank manufacturer, received urgent directives to increase production of the M1340, even as reports confirmed its inadequacy. The logic was brutally simple. Italy had invested enormous resources in the M1340's design and production facilities. Retooling for an entirely new design would take years, and resources Italy didn't possess. The decision was made to continue producing M1340s and their incremental improvements while knowing that each tank rolling off the assembly line was sending its crew into combat at a severe disadvantage. Workers at the Ansaldo factory in Genoa, many of whom had relatives serving in North Africa, understood the implications. Angelo Rossini, a welder who worked on M13-40 production from 1940 to 1942, recalled in a 1985 interview, "We knew the tanks were bad, everyone knew. We would read the newspapers, the official reports claiming great victories. Then we would get letters from brothers, cousins, friends in Africa telling us the truth. The tanks were dying, the men inside were dying, but we kept building them because what else could we do? Italy had no other options. I welded armour plates knowing that some boy from Naples or Sicily would die behind those plates. It haunted me then. It haunts me still." The production numbers told their own story of industrial inadequacy. From 1940 to 1943, Italy produced approximately 160 M13-40 tanks, along with the improved M14-41 and M15-42 variants. This sounds substantial until compared to other nations. Germany produced over 6,000 Panzer III and V tanks in the same period. Britain produced over 5,000 cruiser and infantry tanks. The Soviet Union produced over 20,000 T-34 and KV tanks. The United States would eventually produce over 49,000 M4 Sherman tanks. Italy's entire tank production for the war wouldn't equal what American factories produced in 3 months of 1944. Quality compounded the quantity problem. Italian steel production was limited, and the steel produced was of inferior quality. The armour plates used in M1340 construction contained impurities that made them brittle. Metallurgical testing conducted post-war on surviving M1340 armour samples revealed carbon content was inconsistent, manganese levels were too low, and the heat treatment process was inadequate. The result was armour that spooled catastrophically even from non-penetrating hits, precisely the problem that killed so many Italian tankers. The 47 mm main gun, manufactured at the Breda and Ansaldo arsenals, suffered similar quality issues. The barrel manufacturing process couldn't maintain consistent tolerances, resulting in varying muzzle velocities between supposedly identical guns. Some M1340 tanks had 47 Lobhintus guns that could achieve their rated penetration performance. Others, perhaps manufactured on a different day by a different shift using slightly different steel stock, had guns that underperformed by 20% or more. Italian tank crews had no way of knowing whether their particular gun was adequate or deficient until they fired it in combat, a deadly lottery. The ammunition situation was equally problematic. Italian armour-piercing ammunition for the 47 mm gun used designs that were already obsolete by 1940 standards. The penetrator caps were too soft, shattering on impact with face-hardened armour. The explosive filler was unstable and sometimes detonated prematurely. Quality control was poor, with significant variations in shell weight and propellant charge. British technical teams examining captured Italian ammunition frequently found rounds that were dangerous to fire, with cracked cases or improperly seated projectiles that could have caused catastrophic gun failures. In February 1941, with the Afrika Korps beginning to arrive in Libya, German officers conducted joint inspections of Italian armoured units. The report sent back to Berlin was scathing. Major General Johannes Streich, commanding the 5th Light Division, the first German formation in Africa, personally examined M1340 tanks and declared them unsuitable for modern armoured warfare. His report to Rommel was blunt. The Italian tanks are not combat capable against British armour. They are slow, poorly armoured, inadequately armed, and mechanically unreliable. Their employment in offensive operations would result in their rapid destruction without corresponding enemy losses. I recommend they be used only for static defence or rear area security. Rommel, never one for diplomatic niceties, was even more direct. In a message to the German High Command in March 1941, he wrote, "The Italian M13 tanks are worthless. I have more fear of Italian tanks breaking down behind my advance than I do of British tanks ahead of it. The Italians would serve us better by scrapping their tanks and using the metal for ammunition." These assessments, while harsh, were supported by combat experience. In April 1941, during Rommel's first offensive that recaptured much of Cyrenaica, Italian armoured units equipped with M1340s participated in supporting roles. The Ariete Division, Italy's elite armoured formation, attacked British positions at Machili with approximately 60 M1340 tanks. They faced elements of the British 2nd Armoured Division with cruiser and light tanks. The engagement lasted less than 2 hours. Italian losses were 39 tanks destroyed, 12 captured, and approximately 200 casualties. British losses were 5 cruiser tanks damaged, 2 destroyed, and 23 casualties. The kill ratio remained catastrophically in favour of the British. Captain Adalberto Rossini, commanding a company of M1340s at Machili, survived the battle and wrote a detailed report that somehow made its way to British intelligence. The report, preserved in British archives, provided insight into Italian tankers' perspectives. We advanced in formation as ordered. The British tanks appeared at approximately 200 metres. We opened fire. I observed many hits on enemy tanks. Few appeared disabled. The enemy closed range rapidly, faster than our tanks could manoeuvre. At 600 metres they opened fire. The first salvo destroyed 4 of my tanks. Within minutes, half my company was burning. I ordered withdrawal, but 3 more tanks were destroyed during the manoeuvre. The enemy tanks pursued, firing on the move with accuracy we could not match. My own tank was hit twice. 1 round penetrated the turret, killing my gunner and loader. The second hit disabled the engine. We abandoned the vehicle and retreated on foot. Of 14 tanks in my company, 11 were lost. I do not believe the M13 tank is capable of defeating British armour under any circumstances. The psychological toll on Italian tank crews reached crisis levels by mid-1941. Medical officers reported epidemic levels of what would now be recognised as combat stress reaction among tankers. Men reported nightmares about being trapped in burning tanks. Some developed physical symptoms, tremors, nausea, panic attacks when ordered to board their vehicles. Several cases of self-inflicted wounds were reported, soldiers injuring themselves to avoid tank duty. Captain Giorgio Marini, a medical officer with the Ariete Division, documented the phenomenon in his war diary. The tank crews are breaking. They call the M13 the Iron Coffin. Yesterday, a sergeant with 3 years' service refused to board his tank. He was a brave man, decorated for valour, but he simply could not force himself to climb into that vehicle. He wept, saying he could not die that way, trapped and burning. He was placed under arrest, but I understand his fear. I have treated too many burned tankers, heard too many screaming as they died. The M13 is not merely inadequate militarily, it is a psychological weapon destroying the morale of those who must operate it. German forces, increasingly taking operational control of Axis armoured operations in North Africa, developed tactics that explicitly accounted for Italian tank inadequacy. German battle plans separated Italian armoured units from German panzer formations, assigning them to secondary objectives or defensive positions where their limitations would be less critical. When Italian tanks were used offensively, German forces provided extensive support from anti-tank guns, artillery and air support, essentially using Italian tanks as mobile decoys to draw British fire while German forces manoeuvred for advantage. This tactical arrangement, while acknowledging reality, was deeply humiliating to Italian tankers who recognised they were being used as expendable bait. Lieutenant Carlo Ferrero, commanding a platoon of M1340s during the Siege of Tobruk in 1941, described the situation. "The Germans treat us like ammunition to be expended. They position us in the open where the English can see us, then the Germans manoeuvre from the flanks while the English shoot at us. We are targets, nothing more. The Germans know our tanks cannot fight their tanks, so they use us to die while they fight. It is effective tactics, but it destroys what little spirit we have left." The summer of 1941 brought additional disasters for Italian armour. During Operation Battle Axe in June, British forces attempting to relieve Tobruk encountered mixed German and Italian forces. When British cruiser tanks engaged Italian M1340 positions, the results were predictable. In one engagement near Hafid Ridge, a squadron of British Crusader cruiser tanks, the newest British tank featuring improved armour and the 2-pounder gun, encountered 2 companies of Italian M1340s. The engagement lasted 17 minutes. 23 Italian tanks were destroyed. 0 British tanks were lost to Italian fire, though 2 were disabled by German 80 mm anti-tank guns positioned behind the Italian line. Corporal James Mitchell of the 6th Royal Tank Regiment described the engagement in a letter home that was published decades later. "We came over the ridge and there they were, Italian tanks in defensive positions. They opened fire at long range. We could see the shots bouncing off our armour, no effect at all. We closed range and returned fire. The result was slaughter. The Italian tanks exploded when hit, great gouts of flame and smoke. Some crews tried to escape, but many were trapped inside. It was horrible in its way, shooting at men who had no chance. But in war you don't give the enemy a sporting chance, you destroy him as efficiently as possible." The Italian tanks made it very efficient indeed. By autumn 1941, Italian military leadership had to confront comprehensive failure. The M1340 and its variants were not merely inferior to British tanks, they were catastrophically outmatched. Every engagement reinforced this reality. Italian tankers were dying at appalling rates, while inflicting negligible casualties on British forces. Morale in Italian armoured units had collapsed to the point where combat effectiveness was questionable, even in favourable circumstances. Marshal Ettore Bastico, Italian commander in North Africa from July 1941, sent increasingly desperate messages to Rome requesting better equipment. His November 1941 report was particularly bleak. Our armoured forces cannot sustain operations against British tanks. The M1340, despite the courage of its crews, is inferior in every category that matters for armoured combat. We require modern tanks with adequate armour, effective guns and reliable mechanical systems. Without such equipment, Italian armoured divisions cannot perform their assigned missions. We are sending men to die in machines that cannot protect them or defeat the enemy. This is not warfare, it is mass sacrifice with no military purpose. Rome's response was to promise new tanks that were always 6 months away from delivery. The 640 heavy tank, designed to match Allied and German medium tanks, existed only as prototypes throughout 1941 and 1942. Italian industry struggled to produce the engines, transmissions and armour required. When 2640 tanks finally entered production in 1943, they would be too few, too late, and Italy would be collapsing as a military power. In the meantime, M1340 production continued because there was no alternative. The Ariete division, rebuilt multiple times as it suffered devastating losses, continued receiving S-1340 tanks to replace those destroyed. Crews, knowing the machine's limitations, continued climbing into them because they were soldiers following orders. The cumulative psychological and physical toll was immense. The Eastern Front provided another theatre where Italian forces with M1340 tanks faced humiliation. The Italian Expeditionary Corps in Russia, sent to support German operations in 1941, included approximately 60 M13-40 tanks. Against Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks, the results were even worse than in North Africa. The T-34's sloped armour was essentially immune to Italian 40-cm fire at all but point-blank range. The Soviet 76mm gun could destroy M1340s at ranges exceeding 1,000 metres. Maggiore Alessandro Bertoni, commanding an Italian tank battalion in Russia, encountered T-34s near the Donets River in July 1942. His after-action report described utter helplessness. Soviet tanks appeared at approximately 800 metres. We engaged immediately. Our shells struck their armour and ricocheted without effect. The sound was distinctive, a ringing impact followed by the shell tumbling away. The Soviet tanks ignored our fire and closed range. At 400 metres they fired. The first shot destroyed 2 of my tanks, the round passing completely through one tank and striking the one behind it. Within 5 minutes, 8 of my 12 tanks were burning. I ordered withdrawal, but 2 more tanks were destroyed as we retreated. The Soviet tanks are invincible to our weapons. Fighting them is suicide. The Russian winter of 1941-1942 revealed yet another M13-40 weakness. The diesel engine, while theoretically better than gasoline engines for cold weather starting, proved extremely difficult to start in temperatures below -20 Celsius. Italian tankers, lacking proper cold weather equipment and training, struggled to maintain their vehicles. Many M1340 tanks were simply abandoned when they couldn't be started, left as frozen hulks across the Russian steppe. Soviet forces captured numerous M1340 tanks and conducted technical evaluations. The Soviet reports, available in archives after the Cold War, were merciless in their assessment. The Italian M1340 is primitive in design and construction. Armour quality is poor with excessive brittleness. The main armament is inadequate against Soviet tanks. Mobility is inferior. Crew conditions are unacceptable. The vehicle represents obsolete design unsuitable for modern warfare. It is inferior to all Soviet tank types, including light tanks. Its combat value is negligible. When the Italian 8th Army in Russia was destroyed during the Soviet winter offensive of January 1943, most Italian tanks were lost not to combat, but to abandonment as crews fled the Soviet onslaught on foot. Of approximately 60 13-40 tanks deployed to Russia, fewer than 10 returned to Italy. The rest were captured, destroyed, or abandoned across hundreds of miles of frozen battlefield. Back in North Africa, the Second Battle of El Alamein in October-November 1942 provided the final demonstration of Italian tank inadequacy. The Ariete division, equipped with approximately 100 M13-40s and the marginally improved M14-41 variant, was positioned in the southern sector of the Axis defensive line. When British and Commonwealth forces attacked on October 23rd, Italian tanks faced not only British cruiser tanks, but also American-supplied M3 Grant and M4 Sherman medium tanks with 75 Lobinter guns. The Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate M13-40 armour at ranges exceeding 2,000 metres. The Italian 47mm gun couldn't penetrate Sherman frontal armour at any practical combat range. The technical imbalance had progressed from severe to impossible. Italian tankers were facing machines that could kill them from distances where they had no hope of effective return fire. Tenente Vittorio Mancini, commanding a platoon of M1441 tanks at El Alamein, kept a diary that survived his capture. The entry for November 2, 1942 described the final hours of his unit. The English attacked at dawn with hundreds of tanks, many of them the new American Shermans. We engaged at maximum range, but our shells had no effect. The Shermans fired from distances we could hardly see them. My platoon was destroyed in minutes. One moment I commanded 4 tanks, the next I was alone in a burning vehicle watching my men die. The Sherman's gun made a different sound than the British 2-pounder, a deeper crack followed by an impact like a meteorite strike. My tank was hit 3 times. Each hit sent metal fragments through the crew compartment like shotgun pellets. My loader lost his arm. My driver was killed instantly. My gunner went mad, screaming and thrashing until I struck him unconscious. I escaped the burning tank and surrendered to Australian infantry. I was glad to surrender, glad to be out of that metal death trap, glad the war was over for me. The Ariete Division fought with desperate courage at El Alamein, but courage couldn't overcome impossible odds. By November 4th, the division had effectively ceased to exist. Of approximately 100 tanks committed to battle, all 100 were lost. The division's final radio message, sent in the clear as British forces overran the position, became famous in Italian military history. Enemy tanks are among us. We have no more ammunition. Ariete Division is destroyed where it stands. We are at the end. It was an epitaph not just for the Ariete Division, but for Italian armoured forces in North Africa. German forces, recognising that Italian tanks were liabilities rather than assets, increasingly requisitioned Italian tanks for use as static pillboxes or for conversion to self-propelled guns. The Semovente series, mounting larger guns on M1340 chassis, proved more effective than the original tank configuration. At least as a self-propelled gun, the vehicle didn't need to manoeuvre and could be positioned in prepared defensive sites. The 75 auto-armed Semovente de 7518, while still suffering from armour deficiencies, could at least engage Allied tanks with weapons that had some hope of penetrating. By early 1943, M1340 production had finally ceased, replaced by the M1542, which featured a more powerful 192 horsepower engine and slightly improved armour. But the improvements were marginal. The M1542 was still fundamentally an M1340 with modest upgrades. It still used riveted construction. It still mounted the inadequate 47 Luzenter gun. It was still mechanically unreliable. It was still a death trap for its crew. The Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943 saw Italian tank forces defending their homeland with M1542 tanks and remaining M1340s. Against American M4 Shermans and British Churchill infantry tanks, the results were predictable. Italian tanks were destroyed wholesale. American tank crews, encountering Italian armour for the first time, were surprised at how easily the M1340s and M1542s were destroyed. One American Sherman commander reported destroying 7 Italian tanks in a single engagement without sustaining any damage to his own vehicle. The armistice in September 1943 ended Italian participation as an Axis power. German forces disarmed Italian units and seized equipment including remaining M1340 tanks. The Germans, desperate for any armoured vehicles, impressed some M1340s into service, but found them worthless even by the reduced standards of 1943. Most captured Italian tanks were simply scrapped, the metal recycled for other purposes. In the Italian Social Republic, the German puppet state in northern Italy, a few M1340 and M1542 tanks continued in service with fascist loyalist units. These vehicles were used primarily for internal security and anti-partisan operations where they wouldn't face Allied armour. Even in this role, the tanks were unsatisfactory. Partisan forces armed with captured anti-tank weapons found Italian tanks easy targets. The thin side and rear armour could be penetrated by even small anti-tank rifles. The final combat use of M13-40 tanks occurred in April 1945 as Allied forces advanced through northern Italy. A few tanks fought in scattered defensive actions, usually with crews knowing they had no hope of survival. These were last stands by men trapped in obsolete machines facing overwhelming opposition. The tanks were destroyed as easily as they had been throughout the war, burning monuments to design failure and industrial inadequacy. Post-war analysis by multiple nations' military historians reached consensus on the M1340's status as one of the worst medium tanks of World War II. It combined inadequate armour with insufficient firepower, poor mobility, terrible crew conditions, and abysmal mechanical reliability. It failed in every role assigned to it. As an offensive weapon, it was too slow and too vulnerable. As a defensive weapon, it lacked the armour and armament to hold ground. As an infantry support weapon, it couldn't survive on the battlefield long enough to provide sustained support. The human cost was the true measure of the M1340's failure. Thousands of Italian soldiers died in these tanks. They died burning as diesel fuel ignited from penetrating hits. They died shredded by spelling metal as armour plates fragmented. They died trapped in overturned vehicles as suspensions failed on rough terrain. They died from heat exhaustion in the desert sun. They died from German bullets after surrendering from disabled vehicles. They died knowing their equipment was inferior, their chances of survival minimal, and their sacrifice largely meaningless. Survivors carried psychological scars for life. Post-war studies of Italian veterans found that former tank crewmen had significantly higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder than infantry veterans. The experience of fighting in M1340 tanks, knowing the machine couldn't protect you, couldn't defeat enemy tanks, and could become your iron coffin at any moment, left lasting trauma. Giovanni Favetti, who served as an M1340 driver from 1941 to 1943 and survived 3 vehicle destructions, spoke about his experience in a 1995 interview. "I'm 75 years old, the war ended 50 years ago, but I still dream about those tanks. I dream I am inside, the engine is on fire, the crew is screaming, and I cannot get the driver's hatch open. I wake up sweating, heart pounding, and I am back in that tank again. Thousands of Italian boys died in M1340s. I lived, but part of me died in those tanks too. I cannot forgive the men who designed them, who built them, who sent us to fight in them knowing they were inadequate. We were sacrificed for nothing." The M1340's legacy extended beyond its combat failures. It became a symbol in Italian culture of fascism's empty promises and military incompetence. Post-war Italian historians pointed to the M1340 as evidence of how Mussolini's regime prioritized propaganda over practical military preparation. The regime had promised Italians a modern, powerful military. Instead, it delivered inadequate equipment based on wishful thinking rather than realistic assessment of industrial capacity and design requirements. The tank also demonstrated the consequences of autarky, the fascist economic policy of national self-sufficiency. Italy's determination to produce all military equipment domestically, without importing superior foreign designs or technology, resulted in weapons that couldn't match those of nations with more advanced industrial bases. German and Soviet observers noted that Italian pride prevented adaptation of foreign tank designs that might have been more effective than indigenous designs. Some apologists have argued the M1340 was adequate for its intended colonial warfare role and failed only when misused against peer opponents. This argument ignores that by 1940, when the M1340 entered production, Italy was fighting Britain, a peer military power. The tank was obsolete before it reached frontline units. Any competent analysis of British tank capabilities in 1940 would have revealed that the M13-40 was inadequate. Either Italian intelligence failed to understand British capabilities, or Italian leadership ignored intelligence assessments, or designers were incapable of creating competitive vehicles. None of these explanations reflect well on Italian military planning. The technical comparison with contemporary tanks is damning. The German Panzer III Osef F of 1940 weighed similar to the M1340 but featured superior armour quality, better gun performance, fully traversing turret, more powerful engine, better suspension, and welded rather than riveted construction. The British A-13 cruiser, also similar in weight, had better mobility, superior gun penetration, full turret traverse, and better crew ergonomics. The Soviet T-34, entering service in 1940, was in an entirely different class with its 76mm gun, sloped armour, superior mobility, and revolutionary design. The M1340 was obsolete compared to all major powers' medium tanks the moment it entered service. Italy's industrial limitations meant that even recognising the M1340's inadequacy, there were no better alternatives available. The PT640 heavy tank, designed to match Allied medium tanks, required imported components Italy couldn't obtain. Italian engine manufacturing couldn't produce power plants comparable to German, British, Soviet or American designs. Italian steel production couldn't match the quality or quantity needed for modern armoured vehicles. Italian electronics were inadequate for proper radio communications. The entire industrial base was insufficient for modern armoured warfare. This industrial inadequacy had strategic implications beyond tank design. Italy entered World War II as a major power based on population and geographic position, but lacked the industrial capacity to sustain modern warfare. The M1340's failure was symptomatic of broader Italian military weakness. Italian aircraft were obsolete. Italian naval vessels had design flaws. Italian artillery was outdated. Italian small arms were inferior. Across every category of military equipment, Italian forces fought with gear that was a generation behind their opponents. The M1340 tank serves as a case study in how not to design military equipment. It violated basic principles of armour design by using riveted construction when welding was standard. It violated firepower principles by mounting a gun with inadequate penetration and limited traverse. It violated mobility principles by using an underpowered engine and obsolete suspension. It violated survivability principles by providing inadequate armour and terrible crew conditions. It was a comprehensive failure in every design aspect. For modern tank designers, the M13-40 offers lessons in the importance of realistic assessment of industrial capabilities, the need to prioritise crew survivability, the critical importance of firepower adequate to engage expected threats, and the necessity of mobility sufficient for tactical flexibility. The tank failed because it violated all these principles, and thousands of soldiers paid the price for those design failures. The few surviving M1340 tanks in museums stand as memorials to the men who fought in them. These are not monuments to Italian military prowess, but reminders of what happens when soldiers are sent to fight with inadequate equipment. The tanks represent the human cost of poor planning, industrial inadequacy, and political leadership divorced from military reality. When the Italian M1340 first faced British cruisers at Nibewa in December 1940, the outcome was predetermined by design choices made years earlier. The riveted armour, inadequate gun, limited mobility, and poor crew conditions guaranteed that Italian tankers would fight at a severe disadvantage. What nobody predicted was how completely the M1340 would fail, how quickly Italian armoured forces would collapse, and how lasting the psychological trauma would be. The laughter of British tank crews at Nibewa as they destroyed Italian tanks with contemptuous ease, the tears of Italian crews trapped in burning vehicles, the screams of wounded men shredded by spalling metal. All these were consequences of the M1340's design failures. The tank didn't just lose battles, it destroyed the men who operated it, and became a symbol of how military incompetence costs lives. The final word perhaps belongs to British tank crews who faced M1340s throughout the North African campaign. Their assessment was universal. The Italian tankers were brave men fighting in terrible machines. They deserved better equipment than they received. But war is not about fairness, and the M1340 ensured that Italian courage was wasted against superior British tanks. When the iron coffins burned, no amount of courage could save the men inside.